crucial not only for humanitarian and recovery assistance, but also for long-term peace and stability and sustainability of their livelihoods now and in the future. Now, as Wendy mentioned, we've been working doing research in the Darfur region since 2004 with wide-ranging support, including support from DFID, UNEP, and several others. Now, we've undertaken a range of action research initiatives linked with what we call institutional change activities. In other words, engaging with local, national, international stakeholders in order to bring about positive changes in people's livelihoods. Now, I'm not going to go into all the detail of what we've done before. I just wanted to make the point that all the research we do is very much linked with the perceived interests of local groups. And the need for the particular study I'm going to be talking about today was identified locally in Darfur at a series of 4 livelihood workshops in 2007. These workshops brought together more than 180 national and international actors, probably about 80 or 90% of whom were Sudanese, Darfuri from the region, and through a participatory process were able to reach consensus and come to a shared and common understanding about how conflict had affected the livelihoods of different groups. Now, one of the recommendations coming out of this workshop was that the humanitarian community should really engage much more with pastoralist groups, and in particular, those groups that are associated with the militia, the JJ as they're called, or Janjaweed in Darfur. Now, that recommendation provided the impetus for this study, and since that time, all our work, we've tried to make sure that it comes from those kinds of local interests. Now, while they were focusing on pastoralists more broadly, it was decided that we would particularly focus on groups of camel-herding nomads, collectively known as the Abala, one group of which are the Northern Rizagat, who are often seen as one of the main groups associated with the pro-government militia. I don't tend to talk about Janjaweed or JJ because this, for these groups, it's a pejorative term and not a term they use themselves, so therefore is automatically loaded whenever you use it. So that's probably the last time I will mention it today. Something else I just want to say about our way of working is participation is really central. And participation is a key to learning and change. Obviously, when we use qualitative methods, we're using participatory approaches, but also in this workshop, I think we were pioneering new ways of engaging with stakeholders that wasn't about us telling them our analysis, but it was about coming up with a new, fresh analysis by local resource people. I don't want to say too much about what we mean by livelihoods. I'm assuming you know, but in very simple terms, because we have to have a common understanding, both in venues like this, but also on the ground with the groups that we're working with. Essentially, when we talk about livelihoods, we're concerned with livelihood strategies, what people do, livelihood goals, as I mentioned at the beginning, the livelihood resources or capitals, which is what people need in order to pursue their goals and their particular strategies. What influences this in terms of the broader social, political, policy and institutional environment? And most importantly, how the changing policies, institutions and processes impact on people's livelihoods in terms of what we call a feedback loop, because change is constant, it's dynamic. I also just want to emphasize that this feedback loop generates outcomes that are often very different from people's livelihood goals. Your goal might be an education for your child and they become a doctor. The outcome might be forced displacement, et cetera, et cetera. So outcomes and goals in conflict settings are often very different. And this is a kind of visual representation of that same framework. Now, the focus of our study was very much vulnerability, the evolving vulnerability of pastoralist livelihoods in Darfur. And we used this livelihood lens, this livelihood conceptual framework, to illustrate the processes that shape the vulnerability of the northern Rizagat. In other words, we were interested in causes and ongoing causal processes, not just outcomes. And so our overarching research question is, what are the historical, but also current, prevailing, institutional, environmental, and policy processes that are shaping and driving livelihood vulnerability? And how does this play out in terms of livelihood adaptations, so what people are actually doing now, and the power relations between groups? And this was something that came up in the workshop that we wanted to corroborate. Now, one of the reasons these groups had been identified as worthy of further research was in part because of the lack of understanding and knowledge on the part of the international community about these groups. And that's in part because they have overall been excluded from international processes. And when I say international processes, we're not just talking about humanitarian assistance, peace building, international peace processes, etc. We're talking about the wide range. Obviously, in terms of advocacy, they have a highly politicized image and they've been demonized widely, and a lot has been written about that. But also part of their exclusion is linked to the broader regional discrimination against pastoralists, which is pretty much a global phenomena. Governments tend to favor in their policies sedentary populations. Also, not surprisingly, there was a widely held perception that they were less vulnerable, although it's hard to find the actual evidence of needs assessments to demonstrate that. And of course, finally, as pastoralists, they're hard to reach, they're scattered, and they're often in areas inaccessible to the international community. So who are the Northern Rizagat? The Northern and Southern Rizagat form a confederacy of Rizagat tribes in the Darfur region. The Northern Rizagat are traditionally camel herders or Abala, but they are not the only Abala. There are other tribal groups who are also camel herders and who are not of Arab origin, while the Southern Rizagat are essentially cattle herders or Bagara. The Northern and Southern Rizagat, they have 3 branches in common, while there are 2 that are uniquely Abala. Now, the Southern Rizagat groups tend to be found in South Darfur, and they're united under one tribal administration. In contrast, the Northern camel herding groups are found separately under their own individual tribal administrations. Efforts to bring them under one tribal administration with the Southern Rizagat, or to organise them collectively during the colonial administration, were not successful. And partly that's the reason why they don't have their own tribal homeland, or Dar. Now, it's important to understand a few things about pastoralism, in particular the significance of the pastoralist domain and the importance of mobility and migration routes. Now, traditionally, the Northern Rizagat are the most mobile of all pastoral groups in Darfur, and they officially, there are 11, previously there were 11 migration routes specified by the government for the use of the Northern Rizagat. And this is a map of the old routes. Now you can see those routes run the length and breadth of Darfur. Now these are routes that have been loosely demarcated by the government, but anybody will tell you with camel herding, they don't follow, it's not like following a motorway. And they tend to herd over much kind of broader areas, but essentially 11 groups have been officially demarcated by the government. So they follow traditionally a seasonal migratory movement from the fringes of the Sahara in the far north to the rich savanna in the south. Now, both of those extremes are ecologically very important as part of their pastoralist livelihood system. So they represent a very particular ecology important to raising camels. Now, blocking of the migration routes, particularly to the northern pastures, the Jizu, started long before 2003 as a result of a series of tribal conflicts, and with the Zagawa in the north in 1997, but also with the Fur that's widely known about in the central areas. And it was principally around access to pasture and water. In fact, many groups have not had access to that northern Jizu pasture since 97, and as a result, their camels are not producing offspring at the same rate as if they were able to go up there. And I can tell you more about that if you're interested. Now, currently, since 2003, the blocking of the migration routes has become even more severe, as particular areas have become out of bounds because they're controlled by opposing groups. And as a result, in North Darfur, livestock and nomads have become concentrated in the areas between Kutum and Cape Kabir. So many pastoralists were first displaced from areas in Darzagawa, northwest Darfur, first to Kutum, and then following battles, they were then displaced again, forced to move further south. Now, when they're displaced, they don't go to camps, they go to areas where their tribespeople are, places of relative safety. These are not necessarily ideal conditions for camels. Southerly movements from North Darfur to Kas and Zilinji were also restricted because inhabitants refused to let them past. Now, this represents a very different situation from the past when which has been described as ecological integration between nomads and farmers, which was more about an integration between two production systems in such a way as to maximize mutual benefits for both groups. Now, that's very much a situation of bygone days. Since the 70s, a number of combined pressures have introduced remarkable changes in land use patterns that have negatively affected pastoralists and their relationships to the people around them. So it's not just in recent years that these problems have arisen. It's actually because of a result of changes over the last historically. The most important ones that I want to mention are long-standing and inequitable systems of land tenure and natural resource management. Now, land tenure, as you know, has its roots in 16th century systems of the Fur Sultanate, and it was further institutionalized under colonial rule and post-independent governments. But since then, there have been changing land use practices which have not been widely recognized that have actually affected relations between these groups. And there's a lot more detail on that in our report, and I can mention it if anyone's interested. Another area is the passive and active neglect by national authorities. Not only passive, the splitting of ministries and interests, policy interests in pastoralism has had a direct effect on pastoralist groups. And that's taken place within the wider context of the marginalisation of Darfur. The impact of recurrent droughts on the northern Riza. I mentioned changes in land use patterns and the development of what we call new disadvantageous rules influencing their access to pasture and water. Now, this is pre-2003, so pre the displacement. Local conflict has also contributed. The Fur-Arab War is well known about. Less known is the conflict between the Arabs and Zagawa that excluded them from the Jizu pastures. But also national conflict and regional conflict and tensions with Chad and Libya have played out in terms of the position of the northern Rizagat. Now, our analysis concluded that the relative power of nomadic groups, such as the northern Rizagat, in the build-up to 2003 was far less than that of sedentary cultivated groups, who at that time enjoyed more secure access to land and other natural productive resources. Now, these long-term processes generated a sense of social, economic, political exclusion, which built up over time and basically pushed them into alliances and violence at the end of the 1980s. I should also say that by the time in the pre-2003, at that point, groups actually feared for their survival and felt that there was an element of the rebel insurgency that was actually directed at their destruction and the destruction of their livelihoods. Now, the livelihoods since 2003 have gone through rapid transition. I'm not glossing over the events of the counterinsurgency and the tactics that were employed. The focus of this is really on their livelihoods. So please don't think I've just done this huge leap to bypass their role in the violence. But moving on to talk about what happened to their livelihoods. Basically, traditional livelihood strategies linked to pastoralism declined with the loss of those seasonal pastures. Their livestock trade, particularly with Libya, was completely blocked because they no longer had access to those parts of North Darfur. There were processes of encouraged sedentarization, and by that, promises that if they settled around in the Damaras, etc., they would have better access to health and education. And education was a huge need amongst these groups. So it encouraged sedentarization and livelihood diversification, branching out into a wide range of strategies, many of which they identified as strategies of sedentary groups. Now, at the same time as the Northern Rizagat were adapting and diversifying into new livelihood strategies, they were often also adapting into what we might call maladaptive strategies. Maladaptive in the sense that they are short-term war-related strategies that provide quick returns, but they have no future as they're not based on any legal entitlement or right, often quite the opposite. Examples of these, of course, are the militarization, the military salaries, the collection of firewood and grass collection in areas close to towns where they have a semi-captive market of IDPs. And obviously another reason why these strategies are maladaptive is because their potential link with intimidation, coercion and violence, human rights abuses, negative impacts on the livelihoods of others, fueling tensions with other groups, increasing polarization and conflict. I've got to move on very quickly here. Now, as a result, the camel nomads have what we might call a skewed assets portfolio. Often the livelihood assets are presented in the form of this kind of diagram. Now, if we look at this diagram, we can see that the maladaptive strategies may have broadened their livelihood options and strengthened certain capitals. So, for example, financial capital and natural resources have greatly increased, but the access to natural resources don't necessarily have a legal foundation, a basis in either customary or federal law. While the other strategies, particularly social, human and political capital, have become seriously diminished. Now, I can't give you figures on that because there are no assessments. We have no maternal mortality, malnutrition, maternal literacy. We don't have statistics for these groups. For some reason, they have not been included in the assessments as a group overall. Now, I probably have to think about winding up. There are a number of processes that are shaping vulnerability, ongoing processes, that many of which I've already mentioned. Continuing constriction of the pastoralist domain, militarization of youth, I could say a lot about, social polarization, I mentioned. The loss of local and transnational markets have had a huge impact on their livelihood, particularly the effects on the livestock market and their role in transnational trade. Problems of governance, lack of representation, disillusionment with their leadership, and lack of voice. And of course, ongoing processes of exclusion and misrepresentation. Although I should say, the humanitarian community, the international humanitarian community, more than any other, has actually been engaging with these groups from the beginning. The challenge has been how, and also problems of scale. But also to say that in the last 12 months, attitudes have shifted quite remarkably in Khartoum. I started off by talking about goals. I just want to finish by just saying something about the way in which these ongoing processes are changing people's goals. Now, we all know about the traditional power, authority, status, identity invested in camels. Now that is still there in their heart because camel herding is a culture. It's not a tribe. The Abala has been described to me as a culture, not a tribe. But there has been a shift in recent years towards education and militarization as a livelihood goal. And these are actually conflicting goals, because the militarized youth have gone from the bush to becoming militia without any education in between, which is very different from other combatants in the Darfur region. Obviously, no quick fix. Few points I just wanted to make. When we look at vulnerability, we have to understand that it's qualitatively different for different groups, depending where the deficiencies are. And for that reason, we perhaps have to challenge Western models of humanitarian assistance, recovery and development that focus on vulnerability associated with food security and displacement. There are other sources of vulnerability. I think actually most of my points there were, because I understand them, I feel they should somehow automatically convey themselves to you. The rights to the pastoralist domain. They have rights to the pastoralist domain just as others have rights to land. And it's important to recognize the far north, the Jizu, and also the southern grazing areas as part of this domain. Unless this is recognized, the international peace processes risk reinforcing power imbalances and inequalities. Finally, I think the kind of work that Zara and I have been doing really emphasizes the importance of extending timeframes for analysis and for response. When we take these short snapshots, we risk missing a lot of the complexity and subtleties of the situation, and we risk actually reinforcing some of the problems. Our report has 8 broad areas of recommendations, and also something that we did a lot of work on in the workshop that I don't have time to explain is the idea of a livelihoods conflict cycle, which is generated locally. There are causes of local conflict as well as national and international. So thank you and apologies for going over.